Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. Many climate alarmists appear to be incapable of learning from their mistakes, from history, or from science itself. A month ago, the Australian Bureau of Meteorology told ministers that there won't be any rain until at least April. And now, a month later, the burn areas are getting large amounts of rain. This is very disappointing to climate alarmists at the Sydney Morning Herald. They're upset that the end of the drought is going to cause greenhouse gas emissions to rise. We saw the same cycle 12 years ago in 2008 when the Bureau of Meteorology's head of climate analysis, David Jones, predicted that Southeast Australia was in a permanent drought. The following year, in 2009, there were terrible bushfires in Victoria. But in 2010 and 2011, it rained so much in Australia that it actually caused global sea level to drop. Reality is that Australian summers have gotten much wetter since the end of the 19th century. And the same thing is true for their annual rainfall. Since the big floods of 1974, Australia has generally been quite wet. The weather in Australia and everywhere else is cyclical. You get wet years, followed by dry years, followed by wet years, followed by dry years. But whatever the current weather is, climate alarmists always assume that's the way it's going to be forever. Alternating drought and flood is the normal climate of Australia, and it always has been. You would expect that the head of climate analysis at the Bureau of Meteorology would be aware of this. When people's thought process gets corrupted by superstition about carbon dioxide, it becomes very difficult for them to think rationally. They begin to see every change in the weather as being climate change. And we have exactly the same problem in the United States. In 2012, we had terrible fires here in Colorado. Barack Obama took full advantage of the fires for photo ops and of course blamed them on global warming. Michelle Malkin reported this from Colorado Springs. As Obama sightsees overhead in this key swing state and surrounds himself with first responders for campaign-ready photo ops, his supporters on the ground are busy spewing excuses, attacks, and death wishes on their political opponents. I know, I've received countless numbers of them hoping that firefighters let my mansion burn down and gloating that God is punishing Colorado's conservative population. Climate alarmists were very nasty in 2012, and they've gotten worse since then. The only thing that changed is that Colorado is no longer conservative because since we legalized marijuana, there's been a huge flood of progressives into the state. And a year after the fires, we were having some of our worst flooding on record here in Colorado. Ever since 2012, we've been having generally very quiet fire seasons here in Colorado. In 2008, NASA's James Hansen testified before Congress and predicted a drought-filled future for the United States. But like Australia, the U.S. has gotten much wetter over the past century, and we've had very little drought since Hansen's testimony in 1988. As I mentioned earlier, superstition about carbon dioxide makes it impossible for people to think rationally. The BBC just announced that the Australia fires will be the new normal in the future. Let's take a look now and see if that prediction makes any sense. Australia's largest fires occurred in 1974, when about 11 times as much area burned as did this year. About 15% of Australia burned in 1974, compared to a little bit over 1% this year. At the time, climate alarmists were predicting another ice age. They said telltale signs are everywhere, and they blamed every type of bad weather on global cooling, all the same things which they now blame on global warming. January of 1974 brought some of the worst flooding on record to Australia. It rained so much in 1974 that a 200-mile wide inland sea formed. And at the end of the year, on Christmas Day, Darwin was destroyed by Cyclone Tracy. In April of 1974, the United States had our worst tornado outbreak on record. At least 148 tornadoes in 24 hours on April 3rd and 4th, 1974. That was my freshman year at Arizona State University, and Phoenix had their all-time record heat wave. They had 18 consecutive days over 110 degrees. But never mind science or history. ABC News has a different explanation for the fires. They blame the fires on fragile masculinity. Carbon dioxide seems to do the strangest things. 9 News had a different explanation. They blame the fires on people starting them. It would appear that the people who think the fires are the new normal don't know a lot about science. In order to start a fire, you need to have fuel. After a large fire burns through a region, there's no fuel left to burn, and it takes a long time for the vegetation to grow back so that it can burn again. So large fires can never become the new normal. The energy which produced the fires this year came from stored solar energy which had been accumulating in forest growth over decades. And it will take decades again for enough solar energy to accumulate in the forest growth in order to get large fires like this year. But climate alarmists don't understand conservation of energy. They also believe that they can run civilization off intermittent and unreliable energy sources. The real cause of the bushfires was fuel load which had accumulated on the ground over decades. Last October, Victoria was warned that fuel loads had reached extreme levels. And the New South Wales volunteer firefighters said that the fires had nothing to do with climate change and everything to do with fuel loads. Even the Australian website The Conversation, which has banned conversation from climate skeptics, recognizes that they need to cut down the amount of fuel loads on the ground. And the way to do this is by controlled burns and thinning the vegetation. Even the New York Times recognizes that the Aboriginal people of Australia used fires to cut down the fuel load on the ground. Prior to the 20th century, Native Americans did the same thing on this side of the pond. An area twice the size of New Mexico burned every year, and New Mexico is the fifth largest state. According to the U.S. government, about 10 times as much area burned every year in the United States during the pre-industrial era. Victoria had larger fires in 1939 than they did this year, and after the fires they created a royal commission to study them. The 1939 commission concluded that controlled burning was ridiculously inadequate prior to the fire. People have understood what causes these large fires for centuries, but instead of doing something useful about it, what climate alarmists want to do is take your car away. They also want to take away your plane travel, money, food, and freedom. None of these things have anything to do with forest fires. I grew up in Los Alamos, New Mexico, and used to be a wilderness ranger in several nearby mountain ranges. Los Alamos has been hit very hard by forest fires. They had a huge one in 1977, one in 2000, and one in 2011. The flames from these fires shot hundreds of feet into the air, and the reason for the fires was decades of fire suppression. If you allow a century's worth of stored solar energy to build up in the forest matter, when it all gets released, you're going to have a very large fire. After the fires, many people in Los Alamos thought it was the end of the world. And now, 10 years later, the fuel load is gone off the ground and the forest floor is building up with beautiful new green growth. I plan to travel to Australia in April and hope to see some new green growth coming up in the burned areas. After the New Mexico fires, there was greenery popping up in a matter of 2 or 3 weeks. Forests need fire to regenerate, and taking away people's cars, money, food, and freedom isn't going to do anything to help them. It's just more mindless superstition from climate alarmists who unfortunately completely control the press. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.